Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays. We're getting festive by stepping into the frigid December air and recalling one of our earliest videos, embarking on a quest to find the single best Ice-type Pokemon in competitive history. But what do we mean by best? Well, just as scientists have found that the best Christmas movie is in fact Eyes Wide Shut, we too are unearthing the deep-seated mystery of which Pokemon both strikes the best mix of all-time competitive success, i.e. high tier placement and strong viability in said tiers, and is representative of the best strengths of the Ice-type as a whole. So in order to do that, we first have to delve into a brief history of ice types and how they have functioned across the generations. Ice-type is well known for being one of the worst defensive types in the game, resisting only itself and carrying a boatload of weaknesses. On the other hand, Ice is super effective and neutral coverage is superb. It's downright essential, in fact. Ice being a perpetual staple of most water types movesets, while even the lower strength of Hidden Power didn't stop Hidden Power Ice from being downright mandatory coverage for most electrics throughout history as well. As for the Ice types themselves though, they have been the offensive behemoths that fully dive into the advantages of such an excellent stab, thrashing many of the most important types in the game: flying, ground, grass, and dragon, while neutral targets have much to fear as well, given not just the strong base power of stab ice moves on both sides of the physical special split upon the introduction of Icicle Crash in Gen 5, but also the fact that Game Freak, much to their credit, recognized the Ice type's inherent tendency towards offense and thus gifted many such Pokemon with huge offensive base stats that let them put the pressure even on resist in many cases. That well-known Ice type penchant for offense goes back to the very first generation, where Blizzard was 90% accurate. We shudder to think of a game where it maintained that accuracy in Gen 2 and beyond. Haha, get it, shudder, because it's cold? The move was commonly wielded by Starmie, of course, but Ice types unleashed it both as an offensive weapon and as a tool for inflicting the devastating Gen 1 permafreeze. Jinx in particular was prized for this, and its sleep an opponent with Lovely Kiss, then force it out, since its Ice stab was assisted by another incredible stab in none other than busted Gen 1 Psychic. This unstatus Pokemon switching into it would be immediately threatened by another debilitating status in Freeze. There were some situations where it'd get the 1-2 sleep freeze punch, and in doing so, practically just win the game for you very early on. As far as sheer power went though, Articuno of all things was the king. It would lose its incredible base 125 special attack upon Gen 2 splitting of Gen 1 special stat, but back then, its Blizzard was tied with Moltres' Fire Blast as the single strongest special move in the game, famously outdoing even the mighty Mewtwo Psychic, and as a result, being one of the most devastating attacks in the tier, much like the renowned Ice Spam of more modern generations. Gen 1 also saw the defensive use of Ice types, a far rarer sight. It's not that surprising, considering there were no fighting moves, very rarely any fire moves, and Steel didn't exist. And there was certainly no Stealth Rock. Basically, most of the things we associate the weakness of Ice's defensive typing with weren't around. Meanwhile, the Ice Resist was crucial precisely because going for the freeze was an incredibly powerful strategy in the bulk-focused Gen 1, and Ice types were the only way around it, so they provided a crucial pivot into Ice Beam spamming Chansey, for example. It helped that the primary bulky ices, like Lapras and especially Cloyster, had superb bulk overall, so they were more so leveraging their neutrality to the moves wielded by Snorlax and Tauros in order for their bulk to work out. Tauros sometimes got so frustrated by Cloyster's presence, in fact, it whipped out Thunderbolt, but that was a weakness of Cloyster's water side, funnily enough. Meanwhile, Jinx had crucial defensive utility. It wasn't by virtue of its ice typing, but it was incredibly valuable for its ability to resist Psychic as well as dishing it out. Come Gen 2 though, Ice types' defensive utility as Ices would plummet in the wake of a metagame newly dominated by Electrics, as well as other major forces like Tyranitar and Machamp, and it only get worse in this regard with each subsequent generation. Jinx's foremost defensive utility was blocking freeze from opposing Jinx. It was a bit late to the metagame development party, but Jinx established itself as an offensive threat of such ferocity, it created a fair share of freeze-phobic controversy within the player base, and for anyone who's faced the Kyurem overcoming its counters to the power of repeated freeze fishing in newer gens, you'll know exactly what it's like even if you've never touched Gen 2 in your life. Now, Cloyster was of course one of the most defining Pokemon in Gen 2 OU, combining spikes, Snorlax checking, and a highly efficient explosion or rapid spin. However, Cloyster's success as a defensive Pokemon came in spite of its ice typing, not at all because of it. Neither its quadruple ice resistance nor its freeze immunity were at all useful, considering it didn't take on the metagame's foremost ice spammers at all, It wasn't just destroyed by the Stab Ice Beam or Jinx, but the highly threatening Gengar and Nidoking as well. Cloyster almost never used its own Ice Stab, preferring the crucial anti-Fortress and Tyranitar coverage of Surf, and as great as it was defensively, its Ice typing only held it back. It made it weak to Rock Slide and Cross Chop, and neutral to Fire Blast, which made it much easier to deal with, in exchange for basically nothing of use. This same issue followed it into Gen 3, except there it was even worse off, because it also found itself neutral to Metagross's Meteor Mash. Every time there have been defensive Ice types, they have been flawed. Look at Gen 3 Regice, formerly a special wall until it was discovered to be much more effective when its Ice Beams were offensively invested and it could play more aggressively without having to be delicate about its health. Even those with higher highs, recall Gen 4 Abomasnow, which had a period of almost completely stonewalling popular offensive teams in the post-Salamence metagame, could not be used consistently thanks to both Stealth Rock and their many other exploitable weaknesses that just get worse with every gen, like the fighting weakness becoming more glaring than ever with the addition of Close Combat or Steel in the world of Scizor. There was even an instance of Avalugg being used in Gen 7 OU, primarily because it countered an incredible threat in an opposing Ice type, Kyurem Black, but ultimately it fell out of favor because, as great as its physical bulk and anti-ground properties, alongside Rapid Spin and Recover and Kyurem countering were, it just as a pure Ice type and pure defensive Pokemon could not keep up. Utility, on the other hand, was something Ice types could handle, so long as you didn't need them as walls. They could overcome their defensive flaws, which, to be clear, wasn't the easiest thing, but they would do so in order to leave an impact on the game. Abomasnow and Alolan Ninetales both set up Hail, which had many applications, not just the gimmicky ones, like activating the mighty Ice Body, Wall Rain, or Stall Rain, which was admittedly so scary that Snover was used in the lower tiers. Additionally, Alolan Ninetales' incredible Hail activated Aurora Veil let it set up dual screens in a single turn, making it the face of many hyper offense teams. Newer gens also saw Hail activating Slush Rush sweepers like Arctozolt, which gave Hail teams surprising levels of viability and threat in Gen 8 OU, while lower tiers had the likes of Beartic and Alolan Sandslash, which, thanks to its half-steel typing and amazing moves, including Stealth Rock and Rapid Spin, was itself a solid utility Ice type. Generally though, this was on the specific side. The requirements of Hail were quite restrictive. Stacking Ice types might have been feasible in Gen 2 with how powerful Cloyster and Jinx were, but while far from impossible, it got increasingly difficult to justify across the generations. Thus, the utility you'd most commonly get from Ice types was the incredible priority of Ice Shard, coming off the great attack stats of major threats, especially valuable in the Dragon era of Gens 4 and 5, but permanently useful thanks to its superb coverage. This kind of utility was certainly valuable, but it was secondary in comparison to the primary function of these Ice types, which was to mercilessly bludgeon the opponent. Iconic Ice teams Mamoswine and Weavile took a while to get going. Their introduction in Generation 4 had promise, but was underwhelming. However, with Mamoswine gaining the Icicle Crash it needed in Gen 5, and with Weavile gaining it in Gen 6 alongside the knockoff buff and Steel nerf, they established themselves as amongst the most difficult Pokemon to switch into. Meanwhile, Generation 5 also provided the Ice-type legendary we'd all been waiting for. No, not Arceus Ice, though that did genuinely have a niche for how stupidly destructive its Stab Judgment was in the famously ice-vulnerable Uber tier. We mean Kyurem, of course, and its two forms that it got in Black and White too. Funnily enough, all three Kyurem variants wound up becoming Uber down the line, even though at first it only had one variant that wound up in the highest tier. And that was just a sign of things to come. The last two generations have been two of the most unhinged Ice types of all, with Gen 8's Galarian Darmanitan having an ability that was Choice Band, leading to either a comically overpowered actual Choice Band set or a Scarf set that hit as hard as a Choice Panther, one with ludicrous attack to begin with. Furthermore, the addition of Heavy Duty Boots is an incredible buff to all Ice types. Even the famously fragile Weavile is deceptively decent at taking hits when unbothered by the sneaky pebbles. It almost recalls the surprising bulk of even frailer offensive Pokemon like Gengar in the max stat environment of Gen 2. Then Gen 9 really upped the ante. First Iron Bundle meant everyone had their holidays ruined by the ghost of Robo Delibird Pass, while Hail was replaced by Snow, which also boosts defenses much like Sandstorm has long boosted Rock types' special defense, which led to an already monstrous Pokemon in Baxcalibur going truly over the top as it shredded all in its path. The Ice type is thus established. Above all else, the essence of the Ice type is massive damage, combining huge base powers and attacking stats with incredible coverage. Further utility might be present and it might be quite useful, but it's a bonus. With that in mind, we can move on to the contenders we examined for our pick of the #1 Ice type of all time. What we're looking for among these contenders is a combination of excellence as a high tier as possible, and longevity in the success found across the generations. As such, though we can admire the immense destruction wrought by Baxcalibur and Galarian Darmanitan, especially the latter, which not only shattered OU, but was a force in Ubers as well, they are disqualified from contention because they have only been in one generation each. The same applies to Iron Bundle and Chien Pao, the latter affectionately known as Mega Weavile, both of which rent OU asunder and continue, especially Chien Pao, to have a niche in today's Ubers. Speaking of Weavile, ever since its buff in Gen 6, it has been a force, peaking in Gen 8 where, assisted not just by boots, but a Megastone and Z-Crystal-less game that detested taking its knockoffs, and even a tier it was so much faster than everyone else that it could run in adamant nature for max power, resulting in it finding itself the subject of discussions pertaining to its potential brokenness. It is quite a recognizable pick for this role given its excellence in Gen 6 and 8 of OU, as well as its success in the tier of Gen 7 and 9, while beating the lights out of UU in both, to the point of being banned in Gen 7, which means it's got an argument for the longevity. However, the peaks just aren't high enough. In a similar vein, Mamoswine, though it is an incredibly frightening bruiser with a perpetual OU niche among its never lower than UU placements, especially as its anti-sand and thus anti-metagame peak in Gen 5, doesn't quite reach high enough, though it does fit many players' image of archetypal ice destruction. If we take a look at the Uber tier itself, we've got some strong candidates. Cloyster's Shell Smash antics got it banned from Gen 5, amazingly, and it was also quite decent in Gens 5, 6, and 7 of Ubers, with general viability since Gen 1, including multiple gens of OU. There's an argument to its longevity, but it's also spent a lot of time in the lower tiers, so it doesn't quite reach the apex. Calyrex Ice is a 2-time Uber, but in Gen 8 it doesn't actually get much use in a metagame completely dominated by Calyrex Shadow. In Gen 9, however, Calyrex Shadow got banned, and Calyrex Ice is thriving, establishing itself as a top threat. However, it just doesn't have the longevity. The ice types with the most Ubers appearances are, well, one is Arceus, but Ice Arceus is just about never seen. Because it's niche in even its best Gen 5, though it is scary when it does show up, it doesn't have the competitive history to earn it this title. The other Pokemon is Kyurem White. Now, this one seems like it have to be it, right? That special attack stat, the ultimate Ice Beam spammer, paired with Draco Meteor and amazing coverage, but the truth of the matter is that Kyurem White is never actually good in the Ubers metagame. Yes, at the beginning of its hype in Gen 5, it got used quite a bit, but it was quickly realized that it just doesn't have the speed to compensate for how ridiculously hazard vulnerable it was, as well as the fact that it was hit super effectively by just about everything. Yeah, it has a niche because of how strong it is, but it isn't really part of the metagame. So where does that leave us? What if there were a Pokemon with multiple generations of excellence in OU and Ubers alike? That would really hit the spot. It'd be the most iconic from its longevity paired with excellence. Not Kyurem White, but what about Kyurem, which was banned from OU in Gen 8, and was almost banned from OU again in Gen 9? Not quite. It had a strong OU niche in Gens 5 through 7, while beating up the lower tier Something Fierce, but it doesn't actually have any track record in Ubers itself. But there is one Kyurem form left. Kyurem Black, of course. It started out almost in disgrace, as it was a box art legendary whose strangely sparse move pool, relative to its skill set, let its drop from its initial place in Ubers down to OU. But from there, it racked up 3 generations among the fiercest threats in OU, and then in Gen 8, it finally got some key moves that had been missing and instantly ascended, pummeling OU en route to a ban with a slight niche in Ubers. Then in Gen 9, some more buffs had allowed it to finally reach its ultimate form, resulting in its role as one of the metagame's most dangerous sweepers. Folks, we have found our selection for the greatest ice type in competitive history. Let's see why. Kyurem Black even being suspected when it was in Gen 5 was met by many with outrage, pardon the pun. Nobody could argue that KB would be broken in such a brutally offensive metagame, but this was also a tier still populated by some of the most insanely broken Pokemon to scale. Even Black and White's skyscraper standards allowed in an OU metagame Genesect, Tornadus Styrian, and Landorus Incarnate. Pokemon so busted that they made the broken Deoxys defense look tame, even though DOD got banned before Lando. But you know what else was going on during that time? A small section of the player base asking for Kyurem Black to be retested for the same reason. They protested it being freed in the first place. There are already more broken Pokemon that we can handle running around. We don't need another, even if it's not as busted as those others. All this does is add to the complete evisceration of defensive teams that Gen 5 was already famous for. Though it entered the tier in the midst, and as an example of bureaucratic incompetence, when the dust settled after the generation, nobody could really argue against Kyurem Black's place in the tier. Its many weaknesses meant it could be revenge killed quite easily. However, these revenge killing killers did not want to switch into its immense power, and thus KB took up the mantle that it would maintain in OU for the next several generations. One of the hardest hitters in the game, with its incredible base stat total lending it some solid bulk that led to some nice defensive utility. However, true to the essence of the Ice type, this was secondary, as Kieran Black was all about ushering in the full extent of the new era of the uncounterable, the quintessential wall destroyer. Yes, its resist and bulk were quite helpful against Rain and Sun teams, but you weren't putting KB on your team for those purposes. You were using it because when it hit the field, it was almost surely dropping something. Kieran Black was tested in OU following the realization that it wasn't actually at all threatening in the Uber tier that it had been placed into, owing to a complete lack of physical ice stab. Its signature move, the massively powerful freeze shock, was a 2-turn effort, and not even the nifty paralysis chance was going to compensate for that, nor was it worth it running Power Herb for the one-time effect. If it had had physical ice stab from the get-go, even just Ice Punch, it almost surely never would have entered OU. Mamoswine's Choice Band Icicle Crash is one of the most frightening moves in the tier for its insane spam ability, and KB's Ice Punch would hit even harder. Heck, even Ice Fang would have been fine. Weaker than Mama's Icicle Crash, yes, but something KB would wield with aplomb. Forget the higher power of Dragon Claw and Outrage, KB needed Ice to spam for the cold one-hit KOs that it threatened against the omnipresent Landers, Sea, and Gliscor, and for its neutrality into Skarmory, Ferrothorn, and Excadrill. With such a tool lacking in its moveset, the OU player base decided to use mixed sets, which packed a unique form of Bolt Beam coverage, as it was an Ice type that could run a real electric move in the massively powerful Fusion Bolt. Sorry, Rotom Frost. KB was still a lot scarier even though it didn't have stab on both moves the way you did. Anyway, Fusion Bolt's excellent coverage was the primary reason Kieran Black would dip into mixed attacking with an emphasis on the special side, despite having a lower base special attack stat than base Kieran. The other was its Terravolt ability, a Mold Breaker clone that allowed its Earth power to shred the levitating Rotom Wash and even Bronzong. With Substitute guarding it against status and revenge killing was utterly nightmarish for Sand Balance to handle. Note the distinct lack of Dragon Stab on this set. In the Dragon Age, that was KB wielding the power of his Iceness to the fullest. However, one time, Sub 3 attacks KB, not the easiest Pokemon to slot into teams for its lack of immediate kill power, faded away. There were other mixed KB variants too. Some dropped Sub in the favor of Scizor and Ferrothorn destroying Hidden Power Fire, often with Expert Belt as the item. You would even see the occasional Hail team letting it unleash a perfect accuracy Blizzard. Meanwhile, some offensive teams enjoyed a physical Choice Scarf variant, which turned the tables on would-be checks like Keldeo and Terrakion and cleaned house late game. However, this lean towards an all-out physical approach will find its endpoint in KB's defining set for the generation and the pinnacle of the Dragon Spam era, Choice Band. Choice Band Kieran Black pushed the Drag Mag strategy as far as it would go, assisting its teammates, including Magnezone and sometimes even fellow Ice-type Mamoswine, by busting through many steals through outrageous sheer power alone, making it much easier for its teammates to pick up the pieces. Even if you were facing a Steel type like Jirachi, the move tended to be Outrage. Now, this is more about it being a Dragon and not an Ice type, but rest assured, Ice typing factored into this too. It still fit Ice Beam into its Choice Band set, giving it the unique quality of being a Choice Bander that threatened a one-hit kill on Landers, Therian, and Gliscor. Additionally, that Ice typing, while usually maligned for the weaknesses to Fighting, Steel, and Rock that it added, was also key in limiting revenge killing options. It meant that KB was a Dragon not weak to Ice, so you could forget Ice Beam Starmie taking it out. In fact, KB was unique in actually taking advantage of something as scary as Life Orb Starmie as an opportunity to fire off its attacks. Suddenly, Drag Mag was one of the most popular, successful playstyles in the metagame, and KB was a staple. However, come Gen 6 and the Dragon Immune Fairy type, Kieran Black had to lean into its Ice typing in order to be successful. This didn't mean it dropped Dragon Stab, heck, it still sometimes even ran Choice Band. However, gone were the days of outrageous spamability. Now its greatest weapon was unquestionably Ice Beam, and even though it had to contend with not just Fairy types, but the weakening of Ice Beam's base power, KB thrived. In XY, it actually demonstrated a great deal of defensive utility with a terrific Assault Vest set that devoured hits from the dominant Incarnate Landers and Thundurus, while even a Life Orb Latios Draco Meteor couldn't take it out. But in true Ice-type fashion, it was still a potent wall breaker, and what was particularly impressive is that it did this without much offensive investment, even in its much lower special attack. However, come ORAS, KB leaned into its true calling as an out-and-out wall breaker, most often running 3 attacks with Roost and a Life Orb attached, though it had plenty of variation, not just in the 2 attacking moves it ran alongside Ice Beam, using the likes of Iron Head, Fusion Bolt, Earth Power, and Hidden Power Fire, while also sometimes in ditching Roost for a 4th attack, often alongside a different item like Expert Belt. Fairy types were nice and all, but Clefable was not going to take kindly to a super effective Iron Head from KB's gargantuan attack stat, and the fact was that since KB was functioning almost entirely as an Ice type at this point, Clefable didn't even find switching into its its ultra spammable stab Ice Beam too pleasant. Additionally, with new tools like the buff defog and additional help from a favorite new teammate, Magic Bow's Mega Diancie, KB had an easier time than ever avoiding harassment via Stealth Rock, making it even more adroit at blasting its Ice Beam through the opposition. However, Gen 7 is where KB took its first step into its truest self. Instead of settling for mixed attacking to compensate for its lack of move pool, it could now run the all-out or primarily physical attacking variant, wielding the most wicked ice stab around it always wanted to. It didn't gain anything new, true, but with the addition of Z crystals, Icium Z let it finally unleash its Freeze Shock, or rather Sub-Zero Slammer, in one turn, and this was of course far better than Power Herb since it was working with much greater power. Power so great in fact that it would delete just about anything in its path. It was almost impossible to stop ZKB from picking up a KO if you didn't have Mega Scizor, and if you did, that's where KB's best buddy Officer Magnezone popped up. Funnily enough, players were so terrified and overcautious of playing around the Sub-Zero Slammer, a good KB player could actually get quite a bit of leverage out of using Freeze Shock without the Z, with the 2-turn effect messing with predictions nicely, or attempts to soak the Z hit through Protect. No other ice types have been able to pull off anything like this, using a stab with such luxury. What a dream, made possible by the ever-increasing number of excellent defoggers. Also boosting KB's ice stab was the fact that its complementary electric coverage was often powered up further by Tapu Koko's electric terrain, or Tapu Bulu's grassy terrain, giving it passive recovery and giving it more opportunities to threaten the opponent, and being especially nice for offsetting recoil should KB decide to let a teammate hold the Z and instead run an old school Life Orb set, or Tapu Fini's Misty terrain protecting it against irritating status from Pokemon like Toxapex. It didn't really need support at all though, such was the genuinely insane pseudo auto KO power of its boosted Freeze Shock. In a way, it was the support in how it unstoppably opened up holes to let its teammates clean up. Gen 7 KB was by far the best it had been so far, but it was still nothing compared to what was to come in Generation 8. Heavy duty boots were certainly nice, but even those wouldn't necessarily be needed, because at long last it got reliable ice stab. Okay, Icicle Spear isn't what most people would call reliable, but seeing as KB had literally no other physical ice moves, quizzically not even Ice Fang, this would do just fine. Even a 2-hit, aka 50 base power, Icicle Spear would do just fine off of KB's mighty attack. But that wasn't all, it also got Dragon Dance. Now Dragon Dance KB would have been absolutely crazy even in generations where it didn't have a reliable physical ice stab, arguably to the point of not being allowed in OU at all, but both of these moves together, OU was right to be scared, as his fears came true to brutally devastating effect, with Dragon Dance KB pulling off one insane sweep after another. The power of Choice Band with the flexibility to switch between its amazing coverage meant it could precisely select its move to disassemble you with, and boosting its speed, meaning your average offensive Pokemon wasn't revenge killing it anymore. It got banned very quickly. It didn't do great in the Necrozma Dustmane dominated Uber tier, where players generally prefer Dragon Dance Zekrom, or as far as ice types went, Weavile and Galarian Darmanitan, but it still had a niche for combining these two talents. And in Generation 9, it exploded to truly absurd levels that place it where it is now, as a monstrous threat even in Ubers. The box art promise finally delivered on all these years later. Terastallization is of course incredible on a Pokemon of KB's immense potential. By terastallizing Electric, it removes all of its weaknesses and becomes a bulky Pokemon with just one weakness, while effectively packing true Bolt Beam stab. It was even better when capitalizing on the ever-present electric terrain set by Miraidon before its ban, but still remains ferocious. All the benefits of the ice type, massive stab power, without the downsides of its weaknesses. And what ground stab is going to try and target its new weakness when it's packing such ferocious ice stab? Speaking of which, Icicle Spear is now the scariest physical ice move Kyurem could ask for. Forget Icicle Crash, because with its new loaded dice item, Icicle Spear is now hitting 4 to 5 times every time. 4 times comes to 100 base power, aka Earthquake. And for physical KB to have a stab that strong would already be worth it. But if it hits 5 times, it's hitting harder than an ice type close combat, or Baxcalibur's Glaive Rush, if you will. Oh, and KB gets another new move too, the Dragon type Scale Shot, just as strong as Icicle Spear, also boosted by loaded dice, except it also boosts speed for each hit. You get outsped by Scarf Koraidon after 1 DD, Scale Shots got you covered. KB would have earned the title of best ice type even without getting these Gen 9 buffs, but we are extremely glad that it's only improved with time, and it gets to cap things off with its greatest generation yet. And that's it. Of course, we're open to other perspectives, so if you'd like to make your case for Weavile or whichever other ice, please do. Let us know if you agree, disagree, and generally your experiences with Kyurem Black. Playing against it seems daunting at first, with its box art legendary status, but its flaws are quickly apparent, though that doesn't stop the utterly pummeling effect of its power, especially as the generations go on. Most importantly though, happy holidays, and we hope you enjoyed. Thanks for watching everyone, and as always, if you liked the video and you want to see more, be sure to subscribe to False Swipe Gaming for more weekly Pokemon content, and thank you so much to to our patrons for continued support of our videos, and thank you to everyone else watching as well. And thank you so much to our platinum patrons. Thank you to Amphozenus, Alex Sable, Anthony Belval Renault, Bingleton, Daniel Isbeast, Dr. Mint, Funky, Glitcherton, Howl, Nurse Jake, Jack G, Lord of the Rabbit, Skylaria, Soros and Croxon, Shiwei Miji, Stoneface Colin, Kiboflu, and Quetzalcoatl Northropi for their major support of our videos. And follow my crew on these social media platforms. And that's all I got. See you next time, everyone.